Hey, this is Skylar Hamilton with Freedom or Bust, and we are very grateful tonight to be interviewing Orem City Councilman Hans Andersen. He is also a talk show host on the radio, and an accountant and a legal scholar of sorts, son of one of my heroes, H. Verlin Andersen. And thank you so much for being willing to do this interview.
I'm glad to be able to do it. This is good.
All right, so I guess starting off with why. Why is the battle for freedom? Why are the principles of freedom so important?
Well, I've always been taught we came here to earth because we chose to come here. We also chose to give each other their freedom when we came here. But it seems to be the nature and tendency of almost all men when they get a little authority to exercise dominion on others. And so those that know better, hopefully there are more and more, are say things like we need to limit government. Limit it. Whereas the tendency is for government to grow. And it usually grows in the wrong direction. For instance, if you go back to 1890, you had less than 1% of the federal budget being spent on programs which you might call redistribution of wealth. Now we're up to 85% redistribution of wealth. Of course, that includes the interest too, because we have about 16% on Treasury and Department of Defense, but almost all the money now goes for redistribution of wealth. And that's an indication that the people in this country do not understand the proper role of government. They've used it to plunder one another. And we're just getting further and further away from this Constitution that our founding fathers gave us, which had none of that in it. None of it.
Yeah, I've got a Constitution here. It's pretty thick. In fact, it includes the Declaration and an index, and it's pretty small. I mean,
yeah.
We've got here a city budget that's hundreds of pages long. Why did the founding fathers get that right? What did they get right in the founding documents?
Well, they were willing to say we can have people with all different views, all different beliefs, but what they were trying to do, and I think this is one of the things that made it come out the way it did, was they were trying to get a bunch of colonies who were used to running themselves and saying, thank you, we can run our own state. And so here comes another group that says we want to be over all of these groups, all these states, all these colonies. And they had to convince them. And so to convince them, they said, we'll have very limited authority over you. We'll limit ourselves to 18 things outlined carefully in the Constitution. What most people don't understand is they carefully debated doing a lot of things, including like a university, which they turned down. But a lot of things were debated and they carefully outlined. And so that's where I think they got it right, is they said, this is what we will do. And part of their sales pitch to the people, to convince them that this was what they wanted, was going to be good, is when they did the 5th, the 6th, and 7th Amendments. All three deal with jury trial. And part of the sales pitch, which was a good sales pitch, was if we go astray, you're going to have unanimous decisions by jurors who can overturn anything a federal judge does, anything a U.S. attorney does, anything a federal judge does. And not only that, only one of them has to say, I don't like what you're doing. I either don't think this person is guilty, or I don't think you've got enough evidence to prove he's guilty. And that, to me, was the ultimate faith in the citizens. They trusted the citizens of this country to weigh the evidence as to whether or not the fellow broke a law, and then whether or not the law was even any good or not. They left it up to citizens, and that's another where they got it right. Jury trial.
Yeah. So you talked about redistribution of wealth, and of course that is always via government force, a term we call it as socialism.
Mm-hmm.
Why does socialism fail? Why doesn't it work?
Well, it begins with the premise that all men should have what everybody else has, and it's based on greed. That's why it fails. Socialism appeals to someone who wants somebody else to work for him. It appeals to someone who wants to rule over others. That's why it fails. It turns loose the worst side of human nature. That's what it appeals to, the worst side of human nature, to rule over others and to live off the labor of others. And once it takes over, it just destroys initiative. It destroys, I'm responsible for myself. It destroys, I'm responsible to take care of my wife and my children. It destroys, I'm supposed to save money for my old age. It levels people out to where eventually they don't want to go to work. It destroys the idea that if I work hard, I'll get ahead. Because people who are greedy want to take what he has, and politicians are there to say, why should some have more than others? And that's where they go. And that's what socialism is. Like I say, it appeals to your worst side. You want to rule over others and you want to live off of others. And you can sell it to anybody.
Yeah, and it's ironic too, because often the arguments for socialism are made in similar character. They say, oh, you need to care for the poor, you need to...
Yeah.
But, I mean, people like you and me, we say, hey, the best way to care for people is to respect their freedom, let them go and keep the fruits of their labor. I think that's very interesting. Your father, H. Verlin Andersen, wrote many books. The Great and Abominable Church of the Devil, Moral Basis of a Free Society, Many Are Called but Few Are Chosen, the Book of Mormon and the Constitution. How did your father influence your interest in this battle for freedom?
He taught me.
Yeah.
He talked to me. We had discussions similar to what you and I are having right now. A lot of these thoughts don't come naturally. Most people, they get into an environment and they learn to live with that environment, and they don't like to say, that may be the law, but that's wrong. And the thing he taught me, the greatest rule of all that we need to learn to live by in government, is the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And just about everything that we discussed could be taken back to that golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And how do you apply that to government? Well, would I force you to pay for my child's education?
No.
I probably would not go next door to it and say, I've got 2 or 3 kids over here that need an education, and I see you don't have any. And I feel that it would be to your benefit if my children got an education. So I'll show up. When are your paydays again? 5th and the 20th? I'll be here on the 5th and the 20th to collect your share of my children's education. Or maybe I'm a real do-gooder. I don't have children either, but I'll here collect for my neighbor's children's education. You wouldn't do that. And that's socialism. Do-gooders who want to redistribute wealth and exercise unrighteous dominion on other people. And that's, he based everything on what he felt your conscience says that's right and that's wrong. If you're left to deal with your conscience, it will usually take you in the right direction if you'll ask it and if you'll listen to it and if you'll apply that golden rule to it. Should I do this to my fellow man? Well, I feel good if he did it to me. Or can I justify doing it? And that's the way I was taught. There is a God. He has rules we should live by and the way we should treat one another. And one of his sayings was, be careful how you vote in this life, because that's the way you're choosing your friends for eternity. The same people that you like as political leaders, and a political leader decides how much control dominion you're going to exercise on your fellow man. When you and I go in the voting booth, we attempt to align ourselves with the politician whose views most closely align with our views. And if I want to destroy your agency in this area, I want to redistribute your wealth in this area or this area, that is who I'm going to vote for. And so the clearest view you can have of yourself is, who do I want to run my life, to run my country? Because when you go in that voting booth, you're going to say, that person is going to force my neighbors to do these things that they are not currently doing. This man that I'm going to vote for will force my neighbors to do this. Whether it's raise taxes for public education, raise taxes for a golf course, raise taxes for a public swimming pool, raise taxes for any number of things which we could say this is proper and this is improper. And so you can see what a man's view is of his fellow man and how much agency he wants others to have by who he votes for. And the more he wants to destroy your agency, that's who his friends will be in eternity. That's who my dad is. So look at people. If those are the kind of people you want to be with, that's who you vote for.
So your father had a very, I guess, close friendship with a man who also did much to promote principles of freedom, the proper role of government, namely Ezra Taft Benson.
Yes, they were great friends.
Yeah, do you care to talk about any stories you may have, or the nature of that relationship from your view as a kid growing up?
Well, my father didn't know Ezra Taft Benson until into the 60s. That's when they met. They had some mutual friends who said, you guys would probably like each other. But the way that happened was there used to be a group that would meet every conference. And they would discuss things on government. And it was like 20, 25 men, and they'd take turns saying, in 6 months, why don't you talk about this? This would be of interest. Well, my father was invited to one of these meetings to speak. And after that meeting, Ezra Taft Benson invited my father up to his office and then became good friends after that. You might say they were familiar spirits, birds of a feather. You know, they liked each other immediately because they thought so much alike. Another thing that they had in common was the Book of Mormon. My dad loved the Book of Mormon. He read that all the time. That's what he learned to read. He didn't go to school till he was 8 or 9 years old. He was taught to read out of the Book of Mormon. And Ezra Taft Benson just loved the Book of Mormon. Those were both Book of Mormon scholars, and they, well, just another thing they had in common. They both learned from the Book of Mormon about agency, about government. And most people could never read it and see anything in there about that, but they could.
Yeah.
They could. And after my father died, I went through a pile of correspondence going back 25 years between them. And I enjoyed that. That was fun to see my daddy with all this correspondence going back and forth between him and Ezra Taft Benson over all those years. They were good friends. And that was just fun to see. You know, the concerns they had, the things they were working on together, evaluating each other's thoughts. How do you say this better? Dad used to help him with writing stuff and say you might say it like this instead of like this, you know. They were just good friends. And I'm sure he had other friends like that too. I don't doubt that for a minute. But he sought out people like my dad.
One document we're going to promote, and this is the proper role and improper role of government.
Yeah.
How much influence do you see your father having in that writing?
Well, he spent a lot of time, after he died, I went through and I found several drafts of the proper role of government. And that's the first time I realized that they had spent a lot of time on this, obviously, together. Yeah. Because Dad would work up drafts, send them to President Benson, he'd mark it up, send it back, and they'd say, okay, let's work on this. And the development of it was a good thing to see. It's kind of, back in those days, they didn't have Xerox machines. You know, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have email. And so I found a lot of drafts that were written with carbon paper. You know, you'd see second, third, fourth copies, things struck out, you know, lines going through things, you know, and they'd go through and alter things, hand notes and stuff like that. And that was just fun to see. See, hey, my dad, he's helping Ezra Taft Benson, you know, and that felt good.
And you've had a part in also publishing or republishing some of your father's works, right? Or,
yes.
Yeah, what Yeah, is there anything you'd like to talk about in terms of when did that happen? What went into that decision?
Well, it actually started. My dad sold books starting clear back in '69. He wrote Many Are Called, But Few Are Chosen. And then in '72, he wrote The Great and Abominable. But later on, he went on a mission. In '81, he went to Argentina on a mission with my mother, and so he said, "Son, would you like to take over printing my books and publishing my books, because I'm going to be gone." So he was gone for almost 2 years down there. Then he came home for a year. Then he went to Argentina or to Peru, for a year and a half. And so he did not think that from that distance he'd be able to do it. So he said, "Son, why don't you just take it over?" And so I'd take his books, and I found out that adding another 15 or 20 pages to a book was pretty cheap. And so if you go in and get copies of those books, you'll see different appendixes and pictures and stuff like that I thought, oh, that's interesting, I'll stick that in there. So
I've appreciated all of those.
Yeah, that was fun to do too, because I found I can just put another 15 or 20 pages in the back of these books. And I put in there questions. One that I probably got more comments about than any that I started putting in his books later on was when he was a BYU professor. He used to give his students a questionnaire. It was ungraded, and they didn't put their name on it. Didn't want their name on it. He just, the first day of class, he said, "I just want to get your opinions on different political views or economic views." And what he did not tell them, though, is that included in those 25 to 30 some odd number of questions were the 10 points of the Communist Manifesto. He didn't tell them that's what was in there, but he was trying to get them to register their economic beliefs, what laws they believed in, that government ought to be involved in, or how much they should be involved in. And he summed that up several years by saying, as a whole, his students were about 2/3 communist in their political philosophy. And they did not realize, though, that what they were answering questions about was the Communist Manifesto outlining how to destroy a capitalist society through socialism. This is how they will do it. Appeal to people's greed and appeal to their desire to rule and reign over others with a heavy hand of unrighteous dominion. But they didn't know it. And the thing I thought was of greatest interest was almost all of his students, because he mainly taught upper division at BYU, almost all of his students, they were business majors and accounting majors that took his classes, because he was in the College of Business, and those business and accounting majors were almost all returned missionaries in the LDS Church. And they're communists. They didn't know it. They didn't know it. But they'd all come out of the public education system. They'd all come out of environments where socialism was acceptable. The redistribution of wealth was acceptable. It was desirable. And they believed in it. So that's why I've got more comments on that than just about anything when I went through and took a whole bunch of these. I still had a pile of my dad's tests, where he'd gone through and summarized them. And he'd change the questions every year or two. He'd put different questions in there. Same nature, but, change the questions some. And I could go through and take the percentages where he'd go and summarize 50 or 60 students' answers to these different questions. Like, do you believe in graduated income tax? Do you believe in public education? Do you believe in the inheritance tax? How much should the tax be for an inheritance tax? These are the type of questions he would ask, try to determine how much of the manifesto they believed in. Should government control transportation and communication industries, and manufacturing, and how much? You'd try to give them a lot of questions would give them a chance to write a percentage of what they thought ought to happen, how far the government ought to go, with this program or that program. How much should we redistribute wealth? How much should we take? So
That's awesome. Here's a quick question I thought would be kind of fun. Right off the bat, what is your favorite founding father?
Well, I always liked George Washington. And I suppose most people would think that. He was not the best educated one. I think of all, he was probably as much or the most God-fearing of them. And the thing that he was able to do, which I think was part of the genius of God when he put him down here, was he could take people like Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison and Knox and Jay and a lot of these people that worked with him in his cabinet and worked with him when he was the general. He could get these people who did not like each other to like him. He could get them to work together for the benefit of the nation. He was up here. They were down here. They were good minds, great minds. But he was able to get these people to work together for the good of the nation. That to me was part of God's genius, is to put a man like that, who was not the best educated, not the smartest, not the greatest speaker, who had the greatest understanding of what's the best out of the Roman law that we can pull, what's the best out of the common law that we can pull out of England. You know, he did not have that type of a knowledge, but God put these people here who had very strong feelings about, some wanted more government, some less, but he was there and he was kind of an organizer of it. And they would come to him, all of them would, if they wanted to have peace, and if they wanted to have government, and if they wanted to create this nation. And that's why I thought that was probably why he was where he was. He was a humble man, I felt.